My father wasn't even buried yet, and my brother had already drained every account, $300,000 gone in 4 days. I thought there was nothing I could do. Then my father's old banker, a man who'd known him for 30 years, looked at me across his desk and said, "Your dad left instructions for exactly this. Watch." And he picked up the phone. My father, Robert, built a quiet legacy over 40 years. In the 4 days before his funeral, my brother Kevin nearly destroyed it, draining $300,000 from accounts he had no right to touch. What Kevin didn't know was that Dad had been watching for years, and he'd set a trap. Dad owned a small auto repair shop on the south side of town. For 40 years, he worked 6 days a week, saved every dollar, and trusted exactly one person with his money: Charles, the branch manager at Northridge Savings. Charles knew our family like a fixture of the place. My dad had banked there since before I was born. He'd seen Kevin and me grow up, and he'd watched my brother ask for loans our father always denied. Kevin had a habit of showing up with urgent problems: a failed business venture, a ballooning credit card, a car that needed replacing because he'd wrecked the last one. Every time, Dad said no. Kevin would storm out, disappear for weeks, then resurface at the next family dinner like nothing happened. I loved my brother, but I'd stopped trusting him years ago. When Dad got sick last spring, Kevin barely visited. I was the one who handled the appointments, the medications, the midnight drives to the emergency room. I was there when the doctor told us the cancer had spread, and I was holding his hand when he asked me to call Charles. Just one call to make sure everything was in order. I didn't ask what everything meant. I should have. Dad passed on a Tuesday morning. The funeral was set for the following Monday. Kevin showed up at the funeral home in a cheap suit, dry-eyed, already asking about the estate. He cornered me in the parking lot and said, "Don't worry, Nick, I'll handle the money stuff. You just take care of the flowers." I was too exhausted to argue. That was my first mistake. 4 days later, I went to the bank to withdraw enough to pay the funeral director. I handed over the account number Dad had kept in his desk drawer for emergencies. The teller typed, paused, and turned the screen toward me. The balance was 0. Not a few hundred short, completely drained. $300,000 gone. I asked her to check the other accounts. The joint checking Dad had set up years ago with Kevin's name on it, just for convenience. The savings account with the payable on death designation he'd never changed. All of them emptied in a series of rapid transfers over the 4 days since he died. The teller could see the transaction log. Every withdrawal was signed by Kevin. I stood at the counter with my father's funeral unpaid, and the sudden, sickening knowledge that my brother had stolen everything before the ground had even settled over Dad's grave. And I had no idea how I was going to stop him. I stood at the teller counter for what felt like an hour, staring at the 0 on that screen. The funeral director needed payment by Friday. My father was lying in a funeral home 3 miles away, and my brother had just stolen his entire life savings. The teller looked at me with pity. She'd seen this before. She called over her manager, a woman named Elaine, who pulled me into a small glass office and quietly explained that because Kevin's name was on the joint account, the withdrawals were technically legal, even if they happened after Dad died. The payable on death account was different. That should have been frozen the moment the bank learned of the death, but Kevin had moved so fast. He'd started the transfers the same morning Dad passed, before anyone had notified the bank. By the time Social Security pinged the Death Master file 3 days later, the money was already gone. I asked Elaine if there was anything we could do. She hesitated, then said something I'll never forget. "We have a note on file from our branch manager, Charles. It's flagged for your father's accounts." He asked to be contacted directly if anything like this occurred. Charles, the man who'd known my father for 30 years. I hadn't thought of him in months, not since Dad's last appointment at the bank to update his safe deposit box. I asked if I could speak to him now. Elaine picked up her phone, dialed an internal extension, and handed it to me. Charles answered on the first ring. His voice was calm, older, the kind of voice that had spent decades reassuring nervous customers. "Nicole," he said, "I've been expecting your call." I told him everything, the words tumbling out faster than I could organize them. Kevin, the accounts, the funeral, the 0 balance. Charles listened without interrupting. When I finished, he said simply, "Come to my office, right now. I'll show you what your father prepared." 20 minutes later, I was sitting across from Charles at his desk, the same desk where my dad had sat 100 times to review his finances. Charles was in his late 60s, silver-haired, wearing a vest under his suit jacket like bankers used to do. He had a folder open in front of him, thick with paperwork I'd never seen before. "Your father and I had a conversation about 8 months ago," Charles began. "He came in to update his estate documents. He told me something that stuck with me. He said, 'Charles, when I'm gone, my son Kevin is going to try to take everything. I need you to stop him.'" I stared at him. Dad had known. He'd known for months, maybe years, exactly what Kevin would do. Charles explained that my father had set up a standing instruction, a kind of trigger mechanism. If any withdrawal over $5,000 was made from any of his accounts within 30 days of his death, the bank was required to immediately flag the transaction, freeze all associated accounts, and notify Charles personally before the funds could fully clear. It wasn't a standard banking feature. Charles had built it as a custom internal alert using the bank's fraud detection protocols, with Dad's written authorization on file. My father had essentially planted a tripwire inside his own financial legacy. But Kevin had been fast. The joint account was emptied within hours. The payable on death account followed the next morning. By the time the tripwire activated, the transfers were already processing through the automated clearinghouse system. Charles had seen the alerts fire on his computer the morning after Dad died. He'd tried to intervene, but the system moves faster than any human. The money was already in Kevin's external account, a newly opened account at a different bank, one Charles had no authority over. I felt the hope drain out of me again. If the money was already gone, what was the point of the tripwire? Charles saw my face and leaned forward. "Nicole, your father didn't just set up alerts. He set up a plan. And that plan includes a fraud review that can reverse unauthorized post-death transactions, if we act now." He picked up the phone on his desk and dialed a number I didn't recognize. "This is Charles Brenner from Northridge Savings. I'm calling to initiate a Regulation E dispute on behalf of the estate of Robert Callahan, account holder deceased." "Yes, I'll hold." I didn't understand the legal mechanism at the time. Later, I learned that federal banking regulations provide a window for disputing unauthorized electronic transfers, especially those made after an account holder's death. If the bank could prove that Kevin accessed the accounts after Dad died using credentials or signature authority that terminated at death, the transfers could be reversed as fraudulent. The joint account was trickier. Kevin had survivorship rights, but the payable on death account was clear-cut. Kevin was not the named beneficiary. He had no right to those funds, and the bank had failed to freeze the account in time. That failure gave Charles the leverage to demand a full clawback. Charles spoke to someone on the other end for nearly 10 minutes, his voice never rising above a measured, professional register. He referenced account numbers, transaction timestamps, and a case number from the bank's internal fraud system. When he hung up, he turned to me with something I hadn't seen in days: certainty. "The funds from the payable on death account are being returned as we speak. That's $180,000. The joint account is going to take more work, but I've placed a hold on Kevin's receiving account pending a fraud investigation. He won't be able to touch a cent until this is resolved." I felt my knees go weak. Charles reached into the folder and pulled out another document, this one older, with my father's signature at the bottom. "This is the real reason I asked you to come in," he said. "Your father updated his beneficiary designations 6 weeks before he died. He removed Kevin from everything except the joint account, which he kept only so Kevin wouldn't suspect the changes. But Nicole, when I pulled the records this morning, I found something else. Something your father didn't authorize." He slid the paper across the desk. It was a beneficiary change form for the payable on death account, dated 3 weeks before Dad died. The form listed Kevin as the sole beneficiary, replacing me. The signature at the bottom looked like my father's, but I knew his handwriting better than anyone. The loop on the R was wrong. The pressure was too even. My father had been dying when that form was supposedly signed. His hands shook so badly he could barely hold a pen. This document was a forgery. Charles let me stare at the document for a full minute before he spoke again. "The notary stamp on this form is from a woman named Diane Weaver, registered in the county where your father died. I called her office this morning. She was out of town the week this form is dated. Her stamp was in her desk drawer, locked. She says it wasn't signed out." He tapped the paper. "Your brother used a forged notary seal. That's a felony in this state." I asked how Kevin could have possibly gotten access to a notary stamp. Charles didn't know yet, but he had a theory. Kevin had been at the hospice facility the week Dad died. He'd brought paperwork for Dad to sign, supposedly routine insurance forms. One of the nurses remembered seeing a notary stamp in his briefcase. Kevin had presented himself as the diligent son handling end-of-life logistics, and nobody questioned him when he walked out with a folder full of signed, and possibly forged, documents. Charles initiated a full fraud investigation with the bank's legal department. The forgery alone was enough to freeze every transaction Kevin had initiated. But here's where it got worse. Much worse. As Charles dug deeper into the records my father had prepared, he discovered that the bank accounts were never the main prize. Dad owned property, a commercial building that housed his auto shop, plus 2 rental houses in the next town over. Total value estimated at just under $900,000. Those properties were not in any bank account. They were in a trust. A real estate trust Dad had set up 18 years earlier, the year I was born. The trust was designed to bypass probate entirely. Upon Dad's death, the properties would transfer directly to the trust's beneficiaries, my children. Not me, not Kevin, my kids. Dad had named me as trustee, meaning I would manage the properties until my son and daughter came of age, but I couldn't sell them or use them for myself. The income from the rentals went into education accounts for the grandchildren. The auto shop building generated lease payments from the new owner of the business. Everything was locked up tighter than a vault. Dad had told me about the trust years ago in vague terms, but I never imagined it held this much value, nor that he'd structured it specifically to keep it out of anyone's hands but the next generation. Charles opened another file. Kevin didn't just forge the beneficiary change on the bank accounts, he said. He filed a petition in probate court 2 days after your father died, claiming to be the rightful executor. In that petition, he listed all of your father's assets, including the trust properties. He claimed they were held in Dad's personal name, not in a trust. I asked how that was possible when the properties had been deeded to the trust nearly 2 decades ago. Charles's expression darkened. Kevin submitted a quitclaim deed to the county recorder, attempting to transfer one of the rental properties from the trust back to your father's estate. He used another forged notary stamp. The recorder's office is reviewing it now. My brother wasn't just stealing from bank accounts. He was trying to dismantle an entire trust, piece by piece, using forged documents. If the county recorder had processed that quitclaim deed without catching the mismatch, the property would have appeared to belong to Dad's estate, which Kevin, as self-proclaimed executor, could then sell. He'd likely planned to do this with all 3 properties, liquidate them, pocket the money, and disappear before anyone noticed the chain of title was broken. But the recorder's office had flagged it. The trust had been recorded properly in the county records for 18 years. The quitclaim deed didn't match the current ownership record, and the clerk who received it noticed the discrepancy. She placed an administrative hold on the filing and contacted the trustee of record, me, through Charles. Kevin didn't know that yet. I asked Charles how much damage Kevin could have done if the quitclaim had gone through. He answered immediately. The $900,000 in real estate could have been sold to a cash buyer within weeks, and the money would have been virtually impossible to recover once it left the country or was transferred into untraceable accounts. Kevin had opened a new account at a bank in Nevada, one known for looser reporting requirements. He'd been planning this for months, maybe longer. The forgery at the hospice, the rush to empty the accounts before the bank could freeze them, the probate petition, the quitclaim deeds. This wasn't a desperate act by a grieving son. This was a coordinated theft. Charles contacted the probate court judge and filed an emergency motion to invalidate Kevin's executor petition on the grounds of fraud. He attached the forged beneficiary change form, the affidavit from the notary whose stamp was misused, and the administrative hold notice from the county recorder. The judge scheduled an emergency hearing for the following Tuesday. Kevin was about to walk into court thinking he'd outsmarted everyone, only to find out the entire system had been alerted to his scheme. But there was one more twist, the biggest one. As Charles and I were reviewing the trust documents, I noticed a section I'd never read before, an amendment Dad had added 5 years ago. It stated that if any named beneficiary or their representative attempted to challenge the trust, sell its assets without authorization, or otherwise interfere with its administration, that individual would be permanently disqualified from receiving any future distributions. Not just the perpetrator, their children too. Dad had written a poison pill clause. If Kevin tried to raid the trust, he'd forfeit any inheritance for his own kids, my niece and nephew. The same kids I'd watched grow up at family barbecues. The same kids who had nothing to do with their father's crimes. I sat in Charles's office and thought about that. Dad had anticipated Kevin's greed so completely that he'd built a clause that would punish the next generation if Kevin acted on it. It was brutal. It was precise. And it was now triggered. Kevin had already filed the petition. The quitclaim deed had already been submitted. The legal machinery of disinheritance was already in motion, and my brother had no idea that his own children were about to lose everything because of what he'd done. The only question now was whether the court would enforce the clause, and what I would do if they did. The emergency hearing convened on Tuesday morning in a small probate courtroom on the 3rd floor of the county courthouse. Kevin arrived with a cheap attorney he'd hired online, a man who clearly hadn't read the full case file. Charles and I sat on the other side of the aisle. I hadn't spoken to my brother in 6 days. He wouldn't even look at me. The judge, a woman named Margaret Hinz with 30 years on the bench, opened the file and immediately asked Kevin's attorney why his client had filed a quitclaim deed on property held in an irrevocable trust. Kevin's attorney stumbled through a response about unclear succession. Judge Hinz cut him off. "Counsel, the trust was recorded in this county 18 years ago. The chain of title is crystal clear. Your client's document contains a notary stamp that the named notary has sworn under oath she never applied. Do you have an explanation?" The attorney asked for a recess. It was denied. Charles took the stand and walked the court through every document. The standing instruction my father had left, the forged beneficiary change form, the affidavit from Diane Weaver, the Nevada bank account Kevin had opened 6 weeks before Dad died. Then he submitted the trust amendment containing the poison pill clause. I watched Kevin's face as the judge read it. His expression shifted from arrogance to confusion to something I'd never seen on my brother before, genuine fear. Judge Hinz ruled from the bench that afternoon. Kevin's petition to be named executor was denied with prejudice. The quitclaim deed was declared void and fraudulent. All bank transactions initiated after Dad's death were ordered reversed, and a formal referral was transmitted to the district attorney's office for felony forgery and attempted grand theft. The bailiff served Kevin with a temporary restraining order barring him from contacting me, accessing any family accounts, or approaching the trust properties. He walked out of that courtroom pale and silent. His attorney looked like he wanted to fire himself. The bank completed the clawback within 48 hours. Every dollar Kevin had transferred, all $300,000, was returned to the estate accounts. Charles called me personally to confirm it. "Your father's money is back where it belongs," he said. "The funeral is paid, the estate is whole, and the trust is secure." I thanked him through tears I didn't bother hiding. He told me Dad would have been proud, and I believed him. The district attorney's office moved faster than anyone expected. Kevin accepted a plea deal 2 weeks later. One felony count reduced to a misdemeanor if he waived any future claim to the estate, paid restitution for the legal fees his fraud had caused, and submitted to 3 years of supervised probation. He avoided prison, but he lost everything else. His real estate license was revoked. His credit was destroyed by the legal fees he borrowed to pay. And the notary stamp he'd used was traced back to a former colleague who had left it in an unlocked drawer at a title company where Kevin had briefly worked. That detail gave the DA enough for an additional charge, but they bundled it into the plea. Kevin was spared a felony record, which the DA told me was the only reason his kids wouldn't lose their father's ability to work entirely. Even the prosecutor had thought about the children. The reading of the real trust took place 3 weeks later in Charles's office. I brought my son and daughter, ages 8 and 5. They didn't fully understand why we were there, but they knew it was about Grandpa. Charles read through the documents with the same steady voice he'd used for 30 years. The commercial building, the 2 rental houses, the education accounts, everything Dad had built was now legally and permanently in their names, held in trust, managed by me, untouchable by anyone else. My kids would have college paid for, a safety net, a legacy. Then Charles came to the final section. He paused. "Your father added a codicil to the poison pill clause," he said. He wrote that if you, as trustee, determined in good faith that Kevin's children were innocent of his actions and you wished to provide for them from the trust's surplus income, you had the authority to do so. He looked up. He left that decision entirely to you, Nicole. He trusted you to make the right call. That was the surprise. My father had anticipated Kevin's betrayal so thoroughly that he'd already built the escape hatch for his grandchildren, the ones who shared my brother's blood but not his choices. He just wanted me to be the one to open it. I signed the trustee acceptance form, folded the letter Dad had left for me in the file, and drove to the cemetery with my kids. I told them Grandpa had left them something better than money. He'd left them a lesson about who really protects you. 6 months later, I used the surplus income from the rental properties to open education accounts for Kevin's kids. They're innocent. They'll never know where the money came from, only that their aunt made sure they had options. My father's poison pill clause was never about punishment. It was about handing me the keys to choose mercy after justice had already done its work. I still drive past the auto shop sometimes. The new owner kept the sign my dad painted himself, Callahan Auto, established 1984. Every time I see it, I remember that a man who spent 40 years fixing engines also spent his final months fixing a future he'd never get to see. That's what real protection looks like. Some people think estate planning is just about taxes and paperwork. My dad understood it as something else entirely. A final act of love, written in ink that can't be forged, enforced by people who knew him well enough to act when it mattered. If there's someone in your life who would drain your accounts before your funeral flowers wilt, don't wait. Put it in writing. Find your Charles. Build the tripwire. Because the people who truly love you will honor your wishes, and the ones who don't need something stronger than a promise to stop them. If this story stayed with you, hit subscribe and drop your city and local time below. I love knowing where you're listening from. And when you're ready for more, check the description for stories like this one. I'll see you in the next one.